All right, welcome everyone to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Kirkwood Center is where we connect the best of Christian scholarship to the local church to help equip the church to engage with the culture. We're live today. We got a special, kind of a special event. And as many people will know, we do touch on Roman Catholicism here on the podcast now and again. And we've invited a good friend of the Kirkwood Center to come on live with us today in lieu of the passing of Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, I should say, his born name, or his, but Pope Francis died on Monday. His given name. Yeah, I couldn't figure out what to say there. I wanted to say Ney, the French, N-E-E, born Bergoglio. But anyways, this will be certainly a news story that evangelicals as well will be aware of. Anytime a pope passes, obviously a very big deal. And I think we all sit with some excitement or curiosity about what might come next. So we wanted to have Ed on. Ed is a professor of systematic theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. And he's also the author of this book, which is Pope Francis and the Legacy of Vatican II, which we will link to. So Ed is somebody who has tracked Francis's papacy through the lens of scholarship, theological, academic theologian. So we wanted to have him on to talk about the life and the legacy of Francis, and also what he thinks might be coming next for the Vatican and for the Catholic community here. So Ed, it's good to see you again. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you, brother. It's always fine to be with you. I wanted to start, to say a few words, I wanted to start by quoting a passage from one of the possible successors of Pope Francis is Gerhard Cardinal Muller. He's a German cardinal, was actually the prefect for the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith for several years under Benedict. And one of his many books, he wrote a book called The Pope, His Mission and His Task. This was published in English by Catholic University Press in 2017. But he says something here, which is again, it seems to me an honest perspective of the papacy. He says, in the first place, he says we have to relativize the kind of stereotypes and platitudes that one often encounters, that we're encountering since the Pope died, both in the populist anti-Roman polemic, he says, and in the excessively enthusiastic apologists for the Pope. I know both types of people. And then he says, a divine institution, I know that's a problematic idea for evangelicals, but a divine institution with 266 office holders from St. Peter down to the present day, Cardinal Muller says, cannot remain untouched by the drama of history, the change of epoch, the concrete circumstances and crises, as well as the personalities of the Pope, make the papacy a distinctive phenomenon in the history of the world and of the Church. And here's, in my judgment, the crucial line. A believer sees the Church and the papacy as something instituted by God, but this is certainly compatible with a sober look at the light and shadow in Church history, in their antitheses and in their nuances. He says, indeed, this is demanded by the nature of the matter. So to me, this means, for instance, if you consider, Vatican I regarding the solemnity of the teaching regarding papal infallibility, papal magisterium, well, Vatican I didn't hold to the excessive view of the papacy, where the Pope is an absolute monarch. Mm-hmm. nor did it hold the view, that would be a maximalist view,
Right.
nor did it hold the minimalist view that said that the Pope can only teach in union with the bishops. That would be a minimalist view. That would be an Episcopalism, which the Church also rejects. It's a more moderate view. And the more moderate view is such that to say that the Pope teaches infallibly simply means that the magisterium ascribes the highest degree of certainty to a proposition that it already knows to be true. The Church doesn't make anything true. Marriage is the two-in-one flesh union of a man and a woman. That sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the union of marriage. Well, that's grounded in the order of creation. The Catechism, when it talks about the sacrament of marriage, begins with the order of creation. Creation, fall, and then redemption. Yes, the sacrament is a sacrament of grace, but it's grounded in the order of creation. So we don't. It seems to me important to understand that there will never be a time when the Church says 2 men or 2 women can be married. There will never be a time, because that teaching is true to reality, and then the Church ascribes the highest degree of certainty to that proposition. Okay, so here's the other thing. If we're going to discuss Francis, we have to take the whole man. We can't just pick and choose, or people who say, "Oh, critics or they've misunderstood Francis." I don't believe that. I don't believe it's just a question of misunderstanding. I believe that it's a question, and I think you said that in your article. There are times it's a question of a conflict, a discrepancy between what the Church teaches and pastoral practice. Remember, my example was. Yes, there's never in any of, in fact, in Amoris Laetitia, the encyclical dealing with marriage and love and all that, in chapter 4, the Pope defends, of course, marriage, sexual difference, the body.
Yeah.
That all of these matters, that marriage is the integral principle of marriage is love, but it's the integrating principle of a community, a moral and even a sacramental community, which is grounded in sexual difference. Can't have I always tell my students, when you preach about marriage, don't preach about love. Because we live in a culture, remember? We live in a culture where people say, well, if it's all about love, 2 men or 2 women love each other, why can't they be married?
Right.
So I say, no, don't preach about love. You have to, because it's, the validity of the sacrament, the validity of marriage, has to be grounded in sexual difference. If it's not sexual difference, if there's no sexual difference, if when you say, John Paul talks about this in his, theology of the body, man and woman, he created them, a theology of the body. A theology of the body is really an anthropology. It's really an anthropology. So when the Pope gets to the chapters on the sacrament of marriage, he says there has to be a correspondence between when a man says, I take you as my wife, and the woman says, I take you as my husband. There has to be a bodily correspondence there. There has to be sexual differentiation. Yeah. Now, the Pope Francis defends that. Anybody who thinks that somehow, no. But where the confusion is in the pastoral practice. You see, as I said, when he invites Father, Martin, James Martin, who wrote this book, Building Bridges Between the Catholic Church and the LGBT Community, that practice, taking photos with these people. And John Paul II and Benedict, there was this nun, I don't think she's dead yet, Sister Gramick, which under John Paul II, she was sanctioned. She was not allowed to go out there and talk about marriage or anything like that, because she was a proponent of same-sex marriage and the legitimacy of your identity as a homosexual or lesbian or whatever.
Yeah.
And then we have Francis. And even though the teaching hasn't changed, the pastoral practice is such that it creates confusion in the minds of people.
Right. And when there's no execution of church discipline, when people do things that are or practice things that confuse the laity,
right,
to use the Catholic terminology, it's just sort of it's not dealt with. I mean, as you said, like you mentioned, this nun under that John Paul II and Benedict sanctioned.
Right.
But then, and obviously as evangelicals, we have the same problem.
Oh yeah.
When, if ever, is church discipline ever executed in any kind of concrete and significant way so that it does sort of provide a little bit of a baculum, a little bit of a stick,
right,
that is needed to
boundaries.
Boundaries. Yeah.
We need boundaries. We need clarity. We need, the church has to have a clear understanding of the doctrinal and moral identity of the church.
Yeah.
And boundaries.
Well, I think in the article today that in itself just sort of undermines the church's authority. Well, if they're never going to do anything, if the Pope's never going to do anything, or the bishop, then. Oh, well,
it must not be that big of an issue. Let me ask you a question on this, because the sacrament of marriage, the sacral part of this, the sacredness of marriage, it's not simply sexual differentiation for the sake of sexual differentiation. It's because the command is in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. Right. There's a reproductive aspect to this. And one of the reasons that I understand marriage is sacred is because it is the closest that humans can come to acting out the highest order of creation that God has exercised. And we understand on day 6 that God, when he created man and woman, he created them in his image, and that sets them apart. That aspect of creation is elevated above all other creation. And when man and woman are married and come together, they create new image bearers. And there is a sacredness to that needs to be protected, recognized, and understood. And I never hear that type of language expressed to say this, even if, and you'll get the pushback. Well, what about people after childbearing age? What about people who are born sterile? Yeah. The point isn't that every marriage needs to be procreative. The point is that marriage is the type of thing that if both participants' biology was functioning correctly, then procreation would naturally result. Right. So it's normative in that nature. But we don't talk about this undermining of the sacredness. Marriage will cease to be a sacrament if the procreative element is removed from it, and the procreative element is removed from it by definition if you're talking about same-sex unions. Right.
No, I agree with all that. I think the importance of emphasizing sexual differentiation is that sexual difference, opposite sex couples, they engage in, and this is what I think you were saying, they engage in the type of sex act, the type of reproductive sex act that is open to life, you see. If it's a reproductive type of sex act that's open to life. Only a unitive act can be generative.
Right.
You can't have a unitive act, 2 men or 2 women, whatever the heck they do is not a reproductive type of sex act. And so it's not open to life. And and so it seems to me that that's the importance of, yes, of course, the end, reproduction and procreation and the raising of children. All of that is obviously integral to conjugal marriage. But the problem we have now has to do with the anthropology that informs, the nature of marriage. We don't. So all of that. The Catechism says in part 3, where it's discussing offenses against chastity, and it talks about homosexuality being an offense against chastity, it says that the Church can never accept homosexual sexual acts because they're close to life. But the reason they're close to life is because the unitive is missing, the unitive act. Only a unitive act can be generative, you see. And so all of that is missing. All of that is missing in our contemporary discussions about marriage. I don't know what it's like in evangelical parishes. I mean, I know, for instance, what's his name has written some good stuff. Allison, he's written some good stuff.
Greg Allison on Greg Allison has written some good things recently
good
on theology of the body
and so on.
Yeah.
But I don't. Anyway, that's fine. But
well,
it seems to me we don't get that. Like I said, that's why I always say to my students, when you preach about marriage, don't preach about love.
Yeah. Well, Ed, I want to do this because we kind of got right into the very specific issue.
Right.
Let's take a step back though, because you wrote the book Pope Francis' The Legacy of Vatican II.
Right.
It came out in 2 editions. 16, I think, was initial, and then you expanded it, I think, in the later edition.
2019, became. I revised and expanded it.
For our audience, then, I mean, let's talk about what was the sort of more general milieu that Francis is coming into. A couple generations after Vatican II, you have what we would all, I think, consider conservative, traditional Catholic popes in John Paul II, a very famous pope, right? A very popular pope.
Right.
And then Benedict, who was his successor and also his, headed up the congregation for, what's it called? The Doctrine of the Faith, right?
Yeah.
And a very different kind of papal leader in that than John Paul. This is what happens on live streams. There's the phone. But so what kind of general environment is Francis coming into when he gets elected in 2013 in lieu of those popes and in lieu of Vatican II?
I would say that both John Paul II and Francis and Benedict were very doctrinally oriented popes. For instance, and also grounded in the Second Vatican Council. For the 27 years that John Paul II was pope, and then followed up by almost 8 years of Benedict. In those 35 years of John Paul II and Benedict were trying to provide a proper context for interpreting Vatican II documents, because after the Second Vatican Council, there was the way that those texts were received were such that they were leading the church astray. And so if you think of it in terms of a ship, they were trying to, reorder, turn the ship around. For instance, in 1975, John Paul II called an extraordinary synod having to do with the reception of the Second Vatican Council. And the bishops, and by the way, they were bishops. That's another problem with the whole notion of synodality, is that it doesn't just include bishops, it includes laity and so on, which created the illusion that somehow you now separated teaching authority from ordination, you see. So it became a kind of democracy and so on.
Is this in John Paul II's synod, or the synod on synodality?
No, the whole synod. John Paul II didn't talk about synodality. It was the synod of bishops.
In 75.
Synod of bishops in 75.
Yeah.
And under Benedict as well. And then eventually, when Francis started talking about synodality, it included, since it was, in my judgment, a kind of a imbalance. There was, as opposed to the teaching church, it became a listening church. And so you wanted to listen to everybody. So you invited everybody to come on board. And the problem there was that it created the impression that synodality was an ongoing thing where the church was somehow trying to discern what it teaches and blah, blah, blah. That's all nonsense to me.
But like everything's sort of back on the table now, and we're going to have this open dialogue between laity and clergy.
Exactly. And so you have even see, in my judgment, Francis surrounded himself with people that I wouldn't trust. Okay. But that's another matter. But John Paul II in 1975, calls the synod of bishops on the whole question regarding the reception of the Second Vatican Council. How was it now, 20 years later, after the end of the council? And the bishops of the council, they set out 6 principles for interpreting Vatican II documents. One of the first principle was that you have to attend to all the documents. There are 16 documents, 4 constitutions on the liturgy, the church, on divine revelation, the church in the modern world. There were also 9 decrees, some of the more famous decrees, the decree on ecumenism, Unitatis Red Integratio, and then you had declaration that one of the most famous declarations was on the Dignitatis Humani, having to do with religious freedom, So the first principle was that you have to attend to all the documents in themselves and in their close interrelationship in such a way that the integral meaning of the council's affirmation, often very complex, might be understood and expressed. The second one is that the 4 constitutions have priority. So when you get to, for instance, the declaration on the church's relation to non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, you had people saying, and that's why the council said this, you had people saying that somehow, we now have a more developed view of the church, when we get to Nostra Aetate. That's just nonsense. Declarations are subordinate to constitutions. And so in order to understand the church's ecclesiology, you can't just pick out, the Nostra Aetate. You have to actually go to the Constitution, Lumen Gentium, to understand what the church's ecclesiology was. Also, here's a third one, which is a particularly troubling one nowadays. The pastoral import of the document ought not to be separated from or set in opposition to their doctrinal content. So this is where we have people, in the church, creating an opposition between doctrine and pastoral practice. And here's another one. No opposition may be made between the spirit and the letter of Vatican II, the letter of the text. The letter of the text, the literal sense of the text, which is the sense intended by the authors and so on. When you emphasize, well, what was the purpose of Vatican II? And you say, well, the purpose wasn't fully realized, and you call that the spirit of Vatican II, and then you lead yourself to relativize the text.
Yes.
Because then you're saying, well, you see, the texts, they're not really normative, because they didn't really fully realize what the church should be teaching, you see.
Yeah.
And then it said, and then the fifth is the council must be interpreted in continuity with the great tradition of the church, including earlier councils. The church is one and the same throughout all the councils. It's the development, but you have to talk about what development is and so on. And then lastly, Vatican II should be accepted as illuminating the problems of our own day. in my judgment, yes, Francis, in some of his early stuff, he engaged in a discussion of Vatican II and the whole business about whether it's a hermeneutics of continuity versus a hermeneutics of discontinuity. Mm-hmm. But he didn't have the patience for that. He didn't have the patience for getting into that discussion, you see. And so, in my judgment, at times he appeared to be saying that it's all about what Vatican II in the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, talks about as the law of evangelization, where you have to interpret the gospel in you have to listen to the context and all of that. It becomes as if somehow the project of the church is simply to reinterpret and recontextualize the gospel, you see. And so that creates the impression that there's no unchanging truth and so on and so on. And so again, you got to take the whole man. You got to read all the stuff that he wrote, early stuff, Evangelii Gaudium, which was the apostolic exhortation. When they would have these synods, there would be a document produced as a result of these synods, and the first synod that the Pope was involved in, Pope Francis, he then produced what, on the whole, is a good document. There are problems with it as well, but Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. In my judgment, over time, there's just more lack of clarity. Let me read you a sentence from Pope Paul VI wrote in 1964. This was during the Second Vatican Council, which was 1962, 1965. He wrote an encyclical called Ecclesiam Suum, and he stipulated in that encyclical that one of the proper characteristics of dialogue is clarity. And so he says, clarity before all else. The dialogue demands that what is said should be intelligible. We can think of it as a kind of thought transfusion, he says. It is an invitation to the exercise and development of the highest spiritual and mental powers a man possesses, and so on and so on. Now, in my judgment, I say, this was in my book, not that book, although I did say that. This was in this more recent book of mine that I sent you on Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity. I said, respectfully, throughout the second edition of my book, Pope Francis Legacy Vatican II, I have shown that clarity is precisely one of the virtues lacking in Francis' writings, homilies, and the like. Now, it's also
so that was fairly across the, because a lot of people might just be familiar with the sound bites from the media, but you're saying that also in sermons, writings, and documents that he produced, that there was a similar kind of lack of clarity.
There's a similar kind of lack of. See, I reject where people say, and I know many people, friends of mine, people just misunderstand Francis. I don't believe that. I don't believe it's a misunderstanding. Let me give you an example.
Or that people are just getting partial bits here and there because they're not looking at his whole body of work.
No. Yeah. Well, you definitely have to read the whole body of work. No question about it. But to give you an example, when Francis talks about interreligious dialogue, he says, you engage in the dialogue, you bring the full content of Christian commitment to the dialogue. You want to try to understand, as Benedict said, the otherness of the other in his own thinking. Okay. But then what Francis said is that you have to, and whenever I say this, and whenever I tell people this, they just say, how could he say this? And he says it in several places. He says, you have to, when you engage in interreligious dialogue, you have to withdraw your claim to the absoluteness of your and validity of your beliefs.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that the last time we met. Yeah.
So now I've had a conversation with someone who just said, "Oh, well, you're not understanding him properly." Blah blah blah. Well, on the one hand, maybe all that Francis is saying is that as you can find elements of truth, fragments of truth in other religions, but okay. But here's the bottom line. If Christianity is true, if the central claims of Christianity are true, then Islam is false.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's just no way that you can somehow say that Islam and Christianity are just giving a different account of things. There are competing truth claims and so on. I argue this also because I wrote something about it, but it's also in this book of mine. In Fratelli Tutti, this is the Pope's encyclical dealing with, brotherhood and, unity among men and so on, and particularly in the context where there's, there's pluralism and so on. I just think, I'm sorry. I said to a friend of mine, I'm sorry. No, when the Pope says you have to withdraw your claims to absolute truth and validity, there's no other way to understand him but that he's saying that Christian truth claims are not absolute. That's why he doesn't talk about, as the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue makes clear, yes, general revelation, God's revelation of himself in and through the works of creation. God has not left himself without witness. So we can read the Quran, other religious documents, and we can find fragments of truth there because God has not left himself without witness. But then the Pontifical Council says, but let's not forget that there are also competing and conflicting truth claims, that there are contradictions there between Christianity and these other religions. So we can't just make it. We can't. So that's missing. To me, that's missing in.
Right, and that would be important and this is important, I think, for evangelicals to understand. I mean, I've been reading straight through the Church Fathers, and then I was reading a short book by Gerald McDermott.
Oh yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
The Church Father. It's called God's Rivals, and he's giving an account of, and I think he references Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, and one other, Clement of Alexandria.
Right.
Their views of why God allowed the pagan religions.
Right.
And even more recently, I'm reading some history of the missionaries coming over to Mexico and then engaging with the pagan Aztec religions. There's always a recognition that either, through common grace, general revelation and common grace, that the human mind can recognize some truths. Right.
God has not left himself without witness. That's what it says in the Acts of the Apostles.
But also equally, the Church Fathers and Catholic missionaries coming to the New World recognize that there are obvious distortions. Right. You want to ascribe that directly to Satan, that the devil and his minions are introduce false beliefs into the minds of men, or it's just our sin nature suppressing truth and unrighteousness, or some combination of the two. There are clear and obvious errors that need to be addressed and shown to be false in light of the absoluteness of the gospel, right?
Well, that's you see. So I say that in my book. I say, despite the fact that you have general revelation or common grace, and you have, you're going to find elements of truth there, and et cetera, et cetera. Sin has been at work in the world, and so religious traditions, notwithstanding their positive values, reflect the limitations of the human spirit, sometimes inclined to choose evil. John Paul II says that in an address that he gave prior to, the Assisi meeting in 86. The presence of sin and evil, I say, is recognized. Despite general revelation, its human reception is open to resistance, and hence to distortion, misinterpretation, and rejection. There was also, this whole business, I also discussed this, the idea of a Christology of religions, where people think, from the Gospel of John, John 1, where they talk about, that the Logos lights all men who come, all men in the world, and this sort of thing. And here too, if you look at Nostra Aetate, I remember Benedict once saying in his last address, he said, I love Nostra Aetate, he said, but we have to recognize that nothing that Nostra Aetate said was false, but it was insufficient because it had too positive a view of non-Christian religions.
Okay, so I want to segue in. Well, go ahead, Lenny. But I want to segue into something. I want to talk about the Amazon Synod in 2019. But Lenny, go ahead.
In looking at this, it strikes me as it's more dangerous. Of course, counterfeits are going to have aspects that are identical to the original. You don't assume monopoly money is real currency because it's so different. So when you see, even in biblical times, right, when Israel comes out from Egypt and they build the golden calf, Aaron says, "This is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the God who's delivered you." Right. And so he's got part of that right, but the problem isn't the part that he has right. The danger becomes that the part that he has wrong is leading to death. It's leading to, and to me, that's a bigger caution. When you get closer to the truth, but you aren't the truth, the ability to lead folks astray is increased.
It's greater.
Not diminished. And that's why this kind of thing and those intentional vagaries concern me because they're intentional vagaries.
Ed, that's good. Perfect segue. I want to talk about this because we did a episode when Fiducia Supplicans came out, and we did talk about that, this practice of blessing individuals in same-sex unions and all how that looked and the optics of it all and everything. I don't think we've talked about this yet in detail, but one of the things that I thought was fairly astounding to me was the Amazon Synod. I think it was 2019, right? And there was a lot of controversy that erupted around that synod. There were, these effigies of Pachamama that were being placed in Santa Maria della Ponte, I think one of the churches by the bridge there, to the point of where these two kids from Austria, like took a train down from Vienna, walked into the church,
and they threw it in the water,
into the Tiber River. I was almost in reformational zeal, I wanted to say. But then there was
an example of confusion again. Whatever the intent, it's certainly confusing.
The practice, and there was that. There was this ceremony in the Vatican Gardens with the planting of a sacred tree, and I think there was a dance. But then I think, and I remember, what's the guy's name? Moynihan, who's got the Vatican report, the Moynihan report. He writes a lot about this. And that at the presentation, the final mass to close out that Amazon Synod, when the offerings came up, and I remember this from being an altar boy when I was a kid, when the offerings came up, it was the, obviously the water and the wine and the Eucharist, the hosts. And there was a woman that came up in her traditional Incan garb or Amazonian garb with this pot of dirt with some plants in it from, I guess, her home soil. And if I remember correctly, the potted plant, the for them sacred dirt, was put on top of the altar. Wasn't put even before the altar. Was put on the altar next to the elements, and it stayed there even through, for Catholic, the blessing and transubstantiation of the elements. Now, to me, that was, and I'm not Catholic anymore, but to me that was a fairly, like, talk about confusion. Because if I were to think, like, here, if I'm a Catholic, I'm taking the sacrament seriously. Here's the body and blood of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ on the altar, next to a pot of dirt, sacred dirt, which is
makes no sense.
Yeah.
My judgment makes no sense. Makes no sense. Let me make a distinction here,
Okay.
Because I think you can find throughout the history of the church, certainly in the church fathers, the idea where you're appropriating elements from the culture,
Mm-hmm.
the so-called where you take things. It's like Aquinas
Plundering Egypt, right?
Yes, right.
Augustine's term, I think.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you're doing that, but the fact is it has to be transformed. It has to be transformed in the light of the gospel. It's like Aquinas in his treatise on what's his name, on the Trinity. Anyway, he says at one point about the relationship between philosophy and theology, he says, the relationship is such, it's not like mixing water and wine, he says. It's like water being transformed into wine. And so, you have, throughout the history of our culture, you have theologians, Christian theologians, philosophers, they've engaged, Augustine engages the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, and the same thing with Aquinas and many. And closer to our own times, you had, John Paul II and Benedict, but John Paul II, he appropriated elements of, the phenomenological tradition, and so on and so on, all of those things. But they have to be transformed. It's not just because you have to ask, we're not eclectics, you see.
Yeah.
In Fides et Ratio, his 98th encyclical, he discusses eclecticism, and he says, we're not eclectics because we're not just bringing these things together. We have to understand how they hang together in the system that we're discussing, you see, and they have to be transformed in the light of the gospel, in the light of the Christian tradition, and so on. So, all this business about the Pachamama and all this, to me, that's just a total. This is a total confusion that you think you have to affirm this culture without
its reverence for the divinity of the earth, which,
blah blah blah,
and
blah, blah.
I mean, there was, yeah. Well, it's just one of the other. I think
the earth is not divine. The first thing to say.
But it's always the primary. It's
well, I know
the primary
confusion. It's confusion.
Yeah.
It's total confusion. Those things are just, totally mislead people. Not because you don't think that you not because we don't think that we can learn something from these other traditions, these other cultures, but as we do that, they have to be transformed. You have to engage critically. You can't. One may say, "Wow, I've learned a lot from from Kant's grounding of the metaphysics of morals," but you can't just be a Kantian as a Christian. Whatever it is that you think you've learned, there has to be a kind of a critical appropriation of this.
Right.
It can't just be, oh, I'm just baptizing, as people sometimes say. That's why I always quote Aquinas. Aquinas says the relationship is such that you are not. It's not water and wine. It's water being transformed into wine, and so you're transforming, the thoughts of what's his name, of Kant or or whoever, of Edmund Husserl or Heidegger or whatever.
I mean, do you think Francis's background as a Jesuit plays at all into this? Does that, I mean, because I don't know the history of the Jesuits that well. Now, certainly they started out as counter-reformers, right? But
Right.
there seems to be this tradition, it's even in Pascal's provincial letters,
Right.
of sort of elevating context over content. I don't know how else to put it, like where you start qualifying the theological content of doctrine with, and making all these qualifications for the context of the person in their cultural situation and in their place and time and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, again, there is that. That's why that, in that synod, that extraordinary synod that John Paul II called, one of the principles was we can't oppose doctrine and pastoral context. And the tendency is, I think, in fact, I talk about that in my book, a pastorality of doctrine approach, you see, where it's all about, that's how wrongly interpreted, that the law of evangelization, as I mentioned earlier, from the Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, where the idea is that you understand the gospel in the light of the context and all that. To me, what happened there is that people then take the project to be, we're just always reinterpreting and recontextualizing the gospel, the teachings of the church. And so the church becomes purely a listening church.
And not a teaching church.
To a teaching church.
Yeah.
Well, and this is the second caution that I've seen as well, because I think that many people, both in laity, but more importantly within, say, the media, have assumed that, and they at least hope to assume that they felt that there is something with Francis that gave them a unique opportunity to move Roman Catholicism more towards a progressive ideal than had been available in the past. And, we talked a little bit about this offline, where I think that they did it in a twofold way. First of all, they praised Francis throughout the media. He was, matter of fact, there's even an LA Times article that ran on the 22nd, just a couple of days ago, where it's written by the man who describes himself as a lapsed gay Catholic on how he loves Pope Francis.
Well, he loves Pope Francis because he sees Pope Francis taking photos,
yes,
with promoters of homosexuality and so on. He sees Pope Francis. Here's another thing. Just if I may interrupt you, in my judgment, you're lost if you start speaking of the LGBT community.
Right.
Because that just assumes the legitimacy of a person's identity as being homosexual or lesbian.
Right. And that's
fundamentally grounded in their sexual desires.
The problem with that community is that's how they fundamentally see themselves. They see that as a fundamental issue. And you can go all the way back to the first council, right? The Jerusalem Council. Sexual immorality was one of the four thou shalt not. I mean, they look, we'll give Gentiles a whole lot of leeway, but this sexual immorality thing, that's one that we're sticking with. So, but my point being that the press played this up, and this is a concern for me. Jesus said, they will hate you because they hated me. A student is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Francis got no persecution. And that's a big red flag for me. But the press, I think, did this purposely in order to move a second point. And that second point was to, because they were rewarding him, so to speak, with positive coverage, with accolades, with ways of commendation instead of condemnation, which they had done in the past. They're hoping maybe that this will generate sympathies along these same lines within possibly cardinals, possibly folks who are next in line?
Not anybody that any cardinal. I see that that's one of the questions that. Any cardinal. No, the fact is Muller, Cardinal Muller is one of the possible. Cardinal Sarah, an African cardinal.
Yeah, I'm really interested in him.
And Cardinal Willem Eijk, he's a Dutch cardinal, great man, no question about it.
Isn't there an Italian candidate who's very?
I don't know. There are certainly about a dozen or so. None of the people that are the worst, like in my judgment, the worst. Cardinal Supich from Chicago.
Yeah, my hometown.
Lord in heaven. Cardinal Supich and who else? Cardinal. Oh Lord in heaven, I don't even know how this happened. The cardinal that was just appointed to be the Archbishop of Washington D.C. I forget his name. He was actually a bishop in San Diego, and then the Pope made him a cardinal. And see, that's another aspect of this. The appointment.
Talk about the appointments, Ed, because I keep hearing about Francis's appointments.
Remember, in the Catholic Church, you have apostolic nuncios, so you have ambassadors from the Vatican. So when a new bishop, archbishop, we just received a new archbishop in Detroit. It's not as if Francis knows these people. In some cases, he might, but it's not as if when we say that the Pope appointed so and so, that doesn't mean that the Pope actually appointed so and so. It means that there's the congregation of bishops. The Lord liberate us that the congregation of bishops have Supich and others. The apostolic nuncio, the ambassador to the United States from the Vatican, he receives certain recommendations, and then those recommendations go to the bishops who are on this committee, and then eventually they give a recommendation to the Pope. That's the process of selecting bishops. As far as selecting a new Pope, I mean that involves the whole, all the cardinals of the church. They'll come, the conclave. They'll come and get together. It happens several days after the funeral of the Pope. They will come and all get together. You can't vote if you're over 80 years old. You can come and be there, but you don't have any voting rights when you get to be 80. Mm-hmm. And then they will discuss over several days. They will discuss, who's going to be the next Pope. Now, the fact that that many of these cardinals were selected by Francis, at the end of the day, means nothing, because it doesn't mean that they're all going to, it's going to be a Francis lookalike.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that. There was I read an article recently. Well, it was by Cardinal Muller. He wrote an article where he said the next Pope must affirm orthodoxy, he says, doctrinal orthodoxy. Not because Francis denied doctrinal orthodoxy, but it's the whole way that he did things and the people that surrounded him. For instance, I don't know how you can have as the like in these synodical things. I don't know how you can have as the what we call a relator, the main dude. Somebody who said, "Well, we got to get rid of." The church's teaching and the catechism on homosexuality because we now know better, about those things, you see. I don't know how you can surround yourself with people like that, who are going to say things like that. But in any event, so eventually, they'll discuss and there'll be someone, who's selected. Remember the whole people are waiting and the black smoke tells you that nothing happened, and then if it's white smoke or whitish smoke, it'll tell you that they actually picked one. I remember, and my colleagues and I in 2005 when Benedict was elected, we went crazy because we were ecstatic that that Ratzinger was elected Pope.
Yeah, I was still in Germany a lot in those days, and all my German friends were thrilled, even though most of them were just very nominal Catholics. But there was all these memes going around. Wir sind Papst, and so
yeah.
Wir sind Papst, and they had these images.
Let me just say
Ratzinger
one more thing.
with the Mass of beer and stuff. But yeah,
I used to say to people, I used to say this to evangelical, Protestant, Reformed people that I know, and I'd say to them, I know you're not Catholic, but does it matter to you when the Pope goes? This is before Francis. When the Pope goes to the United Nations and speaks, does that matter to you? And to a person, I've always gone, yes, of course it matters, because the Pope is a Christian and he's speaking on behalf of all Christians. Whatever it is that he's talking about it at the United Nations. And so that's why I think who the Pope is not only makes a difference to the church, as someone said, but it makes a difference also to Western civilization.
Yeah, I mean, evangelicals. Absolutely. I mean, look at this for evangelical. I mean, I have a lot of evangelicals who could care less. I mean, it's just right. But look, I mean, I think most of the people I go to church with, most of the people I know, and Lenny knows as well, like Ratzinger, Benedict XVI was very highly regarded. Well, I mean, in part because he was a great theologian, right? So you're accessing his theological works as well as scholars and evangelical theologians. You're looking at somebody like Ratzinger, like you're borrowing your spiritual exchange of spiritual goods, right?
Right.
And because he's conservative, we believe in co-belligerency, right? I mean, evangelicals and Catholics together. So there are the conservative.
Not a word I would use.
The co-belligerent. I know.
Not a word I would use because you can be a co-belligerent with a Muslim.
No, I know. Okay.
So it assumes when I told you this, when I went to speak at Covenant Theological Seminary, the first thing I said to the guy who invited me, I said, I am not coming to speak as a co-belligerent.
Okay.
I'm there as a fellow believer in Christ.
Yes.
If you don't want to invite me that way, I'm not coming.
Yeah, no, brother in Christ. Absolutely. Brothers in Christ.
You could be a co-belligerent with a Muslim. That's what R.C. Sproul and all these.
I know. It's just a popular term.
No, I know.
You're right. But, we want a conservative vicar in Rome, right?
An Orthodox Pope. Someone who's going to affirm, if you ask the question, was Francis the right Pope for the times? I would say, because the fact is we need a Pope who's actually going to proclaim, not just when I say the gospel, of course he proclaimed the gospel, but I think he has to proclaim the truth of the gospel. He has to proclaim grounded in such a way that people know, hey, we're talking about this is the truth. This is the truth about life.
Well, and where I wrote, what I tried to get at in the article is this was sort of an abdication, maybe intentionally, of his own authority as, the head of the magisterium. If you're not practically enforcing in some way.
Ultimately, but the fact, I've said this to people, Catholics who, they take the Pope to be, they have an absolute monarch view.
Right.
But I think, and so when I raised objections about having, I said it's a synod of bishops. Now it's not a synod of bishops. It's a synod of bishops plus laity, blah, blah, blah. Oh, but they would say, but the Pope in the end decides, you see. But I just think that's not what matters is not just that the Pope ultimately decides. What matters is what goes into the process, the synodical process of talking about these things. And ultimately you have all these people that I wouldn't have invited. And even bishops and so on that I wouldn't have invited. I think that there are too many, too many bishops and even cardinals. Cardinal Hollerich, who was the relator, who told us he backpedaled on that, because I'm sure somebody said to him, "You shouldn't be saying that, about homosexuality and all that." Because it's one thing to say, well, the language, intrinsically disordered. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the language, because it's not just the act; it's also the condition. Doesn't mean that the person is intrinsically disordered. It means that the condition is such that it's ordered to sexual acts that are incapable of being ordered to God. If you don't believe that, well, then you don't. I think you don't believe the scriptures. You don't believe, the teachings of the church, et cetera, et cetera. You just
and it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. I mean, when I think back to Lenny's point about how the media really, wanted to pump up and praise.
Who am I to judge?
Well, it's the who am I to judge, which sounds very relativistic, like a theological egalitarianism that I wrote. But also the real. I don't know. Maybe there wasn't as much emphasis, but it certainly seemed like the emphasis on creation care, environmentalism, the environmental agenda.
The Lord liberate us.
Which I think also, was reflected in that synod on the Amazon. And, where that whole, or his the views on immigration and the sort of constant stick against capitalism in general, without getting into maybe specifics.
Right.
It's like it kind of was like he was a man of his time. I mean, I wrote he was a man of his times, not a man for all seasons, because it just kind of was the 1960s and 70s South American shaped Jesuit theologian, social activist, clergyman who then that's what he was doing. And
this is why I say in Laudato Si, which is many of the people that love Laudato Si, because they see it as, this is environmentalism and this is climate stuff and all this kind of nonsense. I have no idea what climate stuff is, by the way, but all this kind of stuff. No, when I wrote a long article on Laudato Si, integral ecology, the Pope in Laudato Si, if you read it properly, it seems to me, his idea of integral ecology really stands in the line of Benedict and John Paul II, because integral ecology is about the culture, protecting the culture, the conditions under which human beings flourish. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's not just about the earth.
Yes, right.
The earth is not my final, the earth is not the final horizon of my life, So it's about what are the conditions under which human beings flourish? Well, you have to affirm the culture, family, marriage, the body, the Pope is saying there,
right.
And so on. So all of those things are there, but then it was appropriated, and partly because he misinterpreted his own document. It was all about biodiversity, and then all of the stuff that he came out with had to do with environment, as if somehow the final horizon is the earth, and that's what he he invited.
I remember it was like a 2000. I remember watching a video. I don't know. It might have been in that Wim Wenders documentary. Although I can't remember when that documentary came out. Maybe it was 2016. Maybe it was a couple of years into Francis's papacy already, there's this image, I'm sure you could find it easily, of it was an Earth Day or Arbor Day that was being celebrated in St. Peter's Square, and they emblazoned up on the cupola of St. Peter's in laser lights. It was like Mother Earth first or something like this.
I don't know.
And I'm just again, the optics and the symbolism there of Mother Earth is not first.
No, that's why you have to read.
Yeah.
You have to read and take the whole of Francis.
Yeah,
because it's easy to focus on these kind of things.
Just those things, right?
And then the press thinks, the Catholic Church is changing and blah blah.
I mean, let's end with two things. One, I mean, what were some positives of Francis? If you want to highlight any,
I think
positive moves that Francis made during his tenure.
He affirms the teaching on the morality of abortion, the immorality of abortion.
Yeah.
He's against such that he called abortionists to be murderers.
Yes, that's right.
He affirms he was against. Again, there's a tension between this and then the practice, because he also affirmed, he didn't think there was any such things as trans kids or transgenderism, and of course homosexuality and so on and so on. But all of that was inconsistent at times with his practice,
Yeah.
And then his commitment to the poor and of course, there's a place for being committed to migrants. I mean, I always distinguish between migrants and illegal aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two different people that are migrants that are being driven out of their country for reasons of their lives and so on. So there are a lot of things that the Pope was committed to, which I think is good. It's fine, but there are also, confusing things, which is what we've been talking about.
So what do you see? I don't know if you want to speculate too much, but we kind of touched on it. But what do you see going forward?
I have no idea. I mean, I'll tell you, I hope.
Yeah. What would you like to see?
Well, I'd love to see Cardinal Muller. I would be happy with the African Cardinal Sarah.
He's kind of older though, isn't he?
He's 79.
Okay. All right. But that doesn't matter though. There's no age.
Sometimes people say, I mean, look, Francis was 88. Sometimes people say, well,
I mean, not when he got. How old was he when he came in, though?
Well, he was 12 years ago.
12 years, yeah, okay.
So he was 77 or something, or 76. Okay. So it wasn't. Yeah. So for me, Cardinal Muller, Cardinal Sarah, or Cardinal Ike of the Netherlands.
So there's a conservative Dutchman, really?
Oh, absolutely.
Actually, there is.
Cardinal Ike. Is
he the only one?
No, the Dutch bishops. Yeah. The Dutch bishops tend to be good bishops. It's the remnants of post-Vatican II. They thought that there weren't going to be any more priests. The laity was going to run the church, and blah blah blah. All of that nonsense, which never happened, of course. So, okay, I don't know.
African bishop, an African would seem reasonable to me, because I'm looking at sometimes these global population numbers and birth rates, and from what it looks like, it's only a handful of the African countries that have actual positive birth rates and population growth. So I don't know if that matters. Maybe
it would also throw the media fits. How do you cover a conservative pope who's the first black pope in the church's history?
Talk about throwing people for a loop.
I did not.
Well, how are you going to say anything bad about him?
That's right. You're going to have some real difficult times there. I think that
false consciousness. You just, you get
there was this one. I have to go, but there was this one time at one of the 2014 Synod on the Family, some of the bishops were critical of the African bishops, and they suggested that somehow these African bishops weren't enlightened yet. They were still living in the dark ages, and of course.
I was talking to Ian Paul. He's a reverend up in the Anglican. He's saying that there are just people coming and saying, "Yeah, we need to. The African churches, the Anglican church, they're backwards. We need to we need to enlighten them all over."
Yeah, I know.
It's just like, so they're coming out and just being that.
I gotta go.
All right, Ed. Well, this has been really good. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll do it again after the election.
After the election, I'd be happy to come on.
We'll come back on. All right. Thank you, brother. It's good seeing you again.
Take care, brother. Take care, brothers. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, You can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.